Nice to see everybody at 9 a.m. We're here to talk about project estimation and how to get your weekends back. So to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we'll give you an introduction, we'll agree on some terminology, we'll go over how we do project estimation, how we do planning for unknowns, how to determine your team's capacity, and how we allocate, predict, track, and iterate, and give you a conclusion. So weekends are important to us. All work and no play makes developers pretty dull. Tell us a little bit about us. This is Stephen Pashby. He's one of the account managers at DesignHammer. I'm David Minton. I'm one of the partners at DesignHammer. We're a full-service digital agency doing strategy, design, development down in Durham, North Carolina. We're not exclusively a Drupal shop, but we do a lot of Drupal work. So it's Thursday, but the question is, who here is ready for the weekend?
I'm ready for the weekend.
Yep. Who here is planning on working this weekend? Oh no. Well, unfortunately, even though this whole talk is about how to not work on weekends, Steve and I do a lot of business development, so unfortunately we have to work on weekends a lot. But that's us. So we're hoping to get sort of an idea of who's here. So who here is a project manager? Okay, about half of you. Who's a designer? No one. Who's a developer? Okay. Who is multiple hats or other? Okay, a few of you. Great. And where do you do what you do? Do you do it for government? Most of you, nonprofits, digital agencies. Okay, great. I know why you're here. Anybody who doesn't fall into one of those categories? Oh, question? Oh, you're just other. Okay, great. And so who tends to work on weekends? Never. Great, that's awesome. That's our goal for our development, design, staff, is to never work weekends. Who works weekends sometimes? Yeah, I do. Who does it often? And who does it always? That's good, no one's always. That's not healthy. So, the poet, author, singer Maya Angelou said, "Each person deserves a day away in which no problems are confronted, no solutions searched for. Each of us needs to withdraw from the cares which we will not withdraw from us." So we're really big into making sure people get time away from work. And one of the ways you do that is good estimations and scheduling. So kind of an anecdote to start us off on, kind of what talk about traditional scheduling, at least what I experienced in the first part of my career when I was working at other agencies, and unfortunately even kind of somewhat in the early years of our current agency, probably before Stephen was with us. So to give kind of an anecdote, a few years ago, a larger agency came to us to help them out with a Drupal project. So some names will be changed to protect the innocent, some details to protect the guilty. But so essentially they had a job for a decent-sized Drupal build. They had one Drupal developer when they drafted their contract, and for some reason had 0 Drupal developers by the time the contract got signed. Project was scheduled to start in about 2 weeks when they started talking to us, and the project was due in 3 months. Since they had a contract, they obviously had a budget for it and they had an estimate. So, we asked them, what the estimate was. They said it was about 450 hours for the project. So that's great, just so we can get some more insight into what their developer thought they were getting themselves into. We asked, can we see the notes or spreadsheets that were used to develop that estimate? And they said there weren't any. So it makes it sort of a challenge. And then I thought to myself for a second, and I knew what methodology this developer used for estimation. Who can think of what that methodology was?
Swag.
So you think about the numbers. 3 months, 450 hours, 150 hours a month. How many work hours are supposed to be in a work month?
120.
Well, about 160. So this developer gave themselves 7.5 hours a day of development, half an hour a day of everything else, 450 hours, deliver project on time. So luckily we had more than one developer to put on the project, and a project manager and a designer, and it took us about 700 hours to do the project. Did an estimated at 450. Maybe that's why that developer wasn't there anymore. we never asked. We felt it wasn't our business to find out. But unfortunately, that's the way a lot of shops do it. I've been in shops that did it that way. Essentially, you figure out, well, when's it due? I guess we'll get it done. So that's sort of, well, we'll just pick a date. Client picks a date, or even worse, we pick an arbitrary date. Hey, we'll deliver this in 3 months. Then you just throw a whole bunch of resources at it, and then you rinse and repeat. So the upside of that is planning is really easy. Hey, here's the schedule. We'll have this project finished. Everybody knows what the downside is. There's a good chance you're just going to miss the deadlines. If you don't miss the deadlines, you do it by burning out your staff, or having inferior quality, or you kind of take a whole bunch of shortcuts and it may work, but you incur a whole lot of technical debt, or you have budget overruns, or a combination of all the above. So then we ask, like, why is estimating projects and managing capacity really hard? Often, for the better, especially in agency work, you're not doing the same project every single time. There's always differences. Unfortunately, you never really have control. There's always scope creep. And often you're competing for staff resources, either internally or externally. And often some kind of emergency will come up that even if you had everything planned out well, without an emergency, something will throw a wrench in the works. So, I don't know, a number of years ago, we decided there had to be a better way to do this. Maybe we were kind of behind on the curve, but we started doing this way before that anecdote I talked about, so we were obviously not the last agency in the world to figure out that there's a better way. So let's kind of talk about a few things just to frame the discussion we'll have going forward. So we're going to assume that the team is just not dedicated to a single project that can't divert any resources. And either the team leader or management or ownership believes that a good work-life balance is a good thing. My company, we've won a number of national awards for work-life balance, and we have super low turnover rate. I think we were figuring out in our development group, our 5-year turnover rate is under 10%. So, if anyone's not convinced why work-life balance is good, we feel it provides lower burnout, lower turnover. Lower turnover means increased efficiency and increased ROI, and it allows you to do more consistent scheduling. So another great quote from Zig Ziglar, motivational speaker. I believe that being successful means having a balance of success stories across the many areas of your life. You can't truly be considered successful in your business life if your home life is in shambles. So the big question is, how do we do it? So we're really big into estimating, and a lot of that is based on reviewing historic data. So what we'll do is start looking at similar projects, either in what they're doing, if it's for an existing client, how previous projects work for that client, or look at similar features from similar projects, or just scopes, how large or how complex the projects are. We always include time for unknowns because we figure there's always something we don't understand or something hasn't been explained. And we always want to know what our team capacity is before we do planning. Different developers have different efficiency rates, and we always want to take that into account. And we want to make sure that we accurately will allocate our capacity. And then what we'll do is periodically we'll then review our back data just to make sure that our assumptions were correct so that we can make adjustments from what we've learned, or just do the different way we do things, either different methodologies or different internal processes, how that affect projects, and make sure that when we do future estimations that we take that into consideration. So the different tools that we use to try to make this happen, as I mentioned, we're really big into granular time tracking. When we do our project management, we'll use project management software, which is pretty common. We do our time tracking within the project management software. We want to have fairly granular tasks. Generally, you don't want tasks. Some people will say if a task is more than 10 hours, you probably should break it up, and so that we're able to then track time within those tasks. So it helps both keep projects on time, on schedule, and budget, but then also helps when we're doing our future estimations that we can go back and look at a past project and look at individual tasks. So even if a project was on schedule, on budget, we'll look at tasks and say, well, this task was 200% over budget, and this one only took 10% of the budget, so it averaged out, but we want to be able to look, if we're kind of pulling individual features from different past projects to estimate a future one, to know that, well, we underestimated a certain type of work, so on our next estimate, let's try to get that closer. And so that's really important to us. And then we're also doing capacity projection and tracking. I'm a little embarrassed to say that we're still doing it mainly in spreadsheets, but one of our goals this year is to actually move that into a database system. We thought about building our own, but luckily we were sort of behind the curve enough that there's some good SaaS solutions now that we're going to start testing probably later this summer, and hopefully move that aspect into a more robust automated system. So it's kind of obvious, since we've been talking about data so much, the one thing that also has made us kind of hesitant to use automated systems rather than spreadsheets is your estimations and your planning and your tracking is only going to be as good as the data you put into it. And when you got a spreadsheet, generally you can sort of fudge things to make sure that it works, but often a complex database system are often a lot less forgiving of bad data. And this is one of those cases sometimes where if you can't have good data, then it's probably not a good process for you, because the worst thing you can do is go in with bad data. If you don't know where you are, or if your past projects weren't tracked well, then if you're going to try to estimate future projects based on past projects with bad data, it could be worse than just not having any data at all. So let me move on to Stephen, who is one of our practitioners of estimating, who will then walk you through how we actually do this.
Well, great. I noticed a lot of folks are taking notes. We'll be putting our slides online, so you don't need to write down everything, just the really important stuff. So we'll start off talking about project estimation, and we'll kind of, as we looked at in the outline, we'll kind of build through that through capacity and sort of how we think of that. Estimation's kind of hard because you never really know, particularly early in a project, what you're going to need to build. You might have some ideas, you might not. And then you're often going to your understanding is going to evolve throughout the project, right? So, we generally estimate a project at several different stages, and we estimate in a different way at each stage. Kind of initial scoping, and this could be if you're part of an internal team, this could be when you're discussing, is this project something that's feasible? In my role, a lot of times this is if we're looking to bid on something, we want to at least get sort of an order of magnitude, sort of make sure that when we're talking with someone, this is our order of magnitude estimate is something that they're willing to spend, right? That's pretty important. And then following that, we actually really believe in a pretty robust discovery and planning process. And so we're going to do a sort of a different sort of estimating based on that high-level scope of the development work to figure out what we'll need to do in the discovery and planning to create a real estimate, right? Because that's the way that we'll actually have invested enough time with both internally and with the stakeholders to understand what the project actually needs to do. So like I said, the initial scoping is really to determine if you should even undertake this project. You don't know enough detail for granular estimates. You're certainly not going to know, I need this many views and this content types and stuff like that. You might have some ideas, but you don't know anything. So for that, we normally look at other projects that sort of feel about the same amount of complexity. We can sort of say, this looks like a complex feature, this looks like a simple feature. We see this many content types, we've got a data migration that's going to have this many apparent pieces of content. Maybe it's coming from another CMS that we can think about, and that'll lead us down certain thoughts. And then we look at other similar projects that have about the same number of checkboxes. If you've got something that's very similar, it's very likely that you can reason about it, but you might not be able to. You're going to have to make some guesses. But again, this is very early in the process, and you're trying to figure out, is this even something that makes sense? And we look at that sort of scoping estimate from a few different angles. I've just got a couple of samples up here of some theoretical projects. I just watched, was it First Man, the Neil Armstrong story. So while we were working on the slides, so that was fresh in my mind. But we can look at a couple of different pieces that are relevant as we're sort of thinking about project estimation. One is sort of how many hours did it take? How many hours did the staff spend on doing something? Two, how long did that take? Because it's not just 40 hours a week or 30 hours a week or 20 hours a week of development. If you're doing a complex project, there are moving parts and pieces. Not everyone's going to be working full speed the entire time unless the stars align perfectly. And how many staff was involved, right? That will help you sort of just really think about, do we have enough resources to pursue this? Once we have crossed that bridge and decide, yeah, we looked at other similar projects, we've got enough resources, this makes sense to go forward. Then we want to think about how are we going to figure out what's actually going to take to do this project. And we commonly start with a discrete discovery and planning phase. Could be a discrete project, could be something else. But we highly encourage everyone to plan to do some amount of discovery and planning at the beginning so you actually figure out what you need to build. So that, kind of what that looks like depends on your process. For us, we like to think about 20% of the total project budget and total project time frame for that. You can go in different ways. And we're mostly thinking about this from the concept of like a new project build. If you've got an existing site that you're doing something on, you might go with a straight agile approach. But we find if we're building something from scratch or replacing something, we need to have a complete project. We like to approach it kind of this way. So once we've got that idea of what a discovery and planning project should entail, then we can estimate, how much time we're going to need to spend on each individual piece, and we use high and low estimates. None of this is particularly crazy. I noticed that the high and low is reversed. That's embarrassing. But that allows us to actually know what we think it's going to take for that discovery piece. And then as part of that, we'll be able to have more granular estimates for the actual build. And so what that really ends up looking like is, we want to have, here are the different tasks we expect to take. Here's what the different high and low estimates are. We hope to have pretty tight estimates as much as possible here. It could change. We usually wrap this all up in a defined project plan, but kind of however you guys want to do that. But we find it's helpful to have defined features written down and they line up with defined estimates. So then we plan for the unknown, because that's pretty critical. Because what you don't know can run your project massively over budget or off schedule. The classic Donald Rumsfeld quote, as we know there are known knowns, there are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. So since you've got a granular set of estimates, that really is this is an optimistic outlook on the project. I mean, even with the high and low estimates, it's still optimistic. You think you have an idea of the scope. You may not know how long it's going to take you to develop a particular feature, but you think you've got everything in your spreadsheet all checked out. But that doesn't account for the feature that was implied that you did not estimate. It doesn't account for the feature that took 3 times as long as expected, because really the high and low estimates that people tend to produce is really a best case and maybe average case. It's not really a worst case. And if you plan for everything with worst case, then no one would ever agree to do any projects because they'd never get done. So we have to assume that you're going to come in average in a lot of cases. But that one feature that takes 3 times as long, you haven't planned for that in those granular estimates. Or, hey, here's a critical business process that you didn't know about that is necessary for this project to be successful. It's out of scope. That's great and all, but it needs to happen. So there are several ways to capture uncertainty like this. One is ranges and estimates. We just talked about why that's not ideal, because again, at least every developer I've worked with, they've got, it should take me this long, so let's add maybe 20% on that. It should be fine. That's pretty optimistic. I know one developer said that I'm very good at looking for snakes in the grass. Like, what's here that may not be obvious that could bite us, right? It could endanger the project. So, ranges and estimates, not perfect. I know a lot of folks do kind of an uncertainty modifier on each task. We haven't done that yet, but it seems like a pretty decent system. Instead, we actually like to do a percentage estimate over all tasks, or maybe a selection of the tasks, a body of them. Like all dev tasks, for example. And that's basically a bucket of unknowns hours that we know we're likely going to need, but it's not. We don't know what we're going to need them for yet. But it allows us to do a lot of different things. One, it lets us actually, have some flexibility beyond the granular ticket level. And 2, it lets us, say yes to things that come up that we need to be able to deal with from a keeping the stakeholders happy perspective. We generally do a 20% unknowns budget. That's something that's a good place for looking at historic data. Our historic data for us, 20% unknowns is usually pretty safe. We review that periodically. But now you've got your unknowns time captured. You don't want to you don't want to forget your QA or project management time. So we also capture those with percentages on top there. So once we've got our granular estimates for the tasks, we then overlay several percentages over either groups of tasks or all tasks, so that we're able to say, okay, our project management percentage historically is X, so we're going to add X onto what we think this project will take. And now it's not like a hard and fast rule. It might vary if we say, oh, hey, this project has a lot of stakeholders. Maybe we're going to increase both the unknowns percentage and the project management percentage. But again, we're starting from a place of we've accounted for this and we're able to then adjust it if we need to. So you've got a realistic estimate. Now what? It's weekend time, right? Not exactly. Now you need to figure out how you're going to kind of make this estimate work with the team you've got. What is capacity? It's a good question. So, broadly we think of capacity as your ability to do projects, like how many hours is your staff going to work, or your team going to work to be able to get stuff done. But not all work is equal, so let's define some different terms. So one thing we want to think about is non-productive time. So that's time not directly associated with manufacturing operations or performance of job or task. It's contrasted with productive time, where you're actually doing something to move something ahead. So some examples of non-productive time, waiting for work, right? This is a sign that your staff is going to get paid for because they're at the desk, they're waiting for something, but it's not productive. They take a coffee break, it's non-productive time. I'm not saying don't do that, it's just like this is part of the system, right? This is different in our mind than overhead, right? So overhead is where resources consumed or lost as part of completing the process, but doesn't really go directly to the end product. So for our purposes, there is this category of productive work that's not related directly to a project, right? So you need to think about that. So some examples of overhead. Do you have a team meeting where you talk about the different projects that are going on? I mean, that's productive. That's super important for your team to run well. But that's not part of your project estimate, right? Training. You want folks to be improving their skills, right? I know, one thing that we really focus on is folks are expected to engage in training. That is productive, but it's overhead, right? Where this is stuff where we're not going to, we as an agency are not going to build this to a client because it's not for a project. Going to a conference, right? I hope a lot of you are able to actually use this as part of your job, but it is overhead. I would argue this is productive, but this is still overhead. So, you can look and you can find different percentages of overhead versus versus project work or whatever out there. I don't think that's very helpful, right? Because teams are different. Your team has different responsibilities. You have different people on your team. Organizations run things differently. So our method is to actually plan based on how the team has performed in the past and look to improve over time rather than pick arbitrary goals and try to measure against that. So kind of our concept is you and your team can sustainably complete a certain amount of productive hours per week, and within those hours a certain amount of project work, right? So at a super high level, the total of your productive time minus your productive overhead is your potential capacity for doing projects, right? So what's your team's capacity, right? 40 hours a week per person, right? No. So start looking at the data, right? So we kind of audit the data kind of for the past 6 or 12 months, and we look at total time tracked, and we do it monthly, and then just divide that by 4 to kind of get a weekly average. And then we want to kind of slice and dice by productive time versus non-productive time. And within productive time, project work versus overhead. So to continue with our NASA examples, we've got average weekly time tracked for Neil, Buzz, Alan, and Chuck. This all looks pretty good, right? I mean, they're tracking right at 40 hours a week. Everything's great, right? They're putting in the time. But these raw numbers don't actually provide much insight into how much work is getting done, right? Or how efficiently the team is able to work. So if we take those numbers and we look at averages and we say, well, Neil averages doing 32 hours of productive work a week. Buzz 35, Alan's 30, and Chuck's 26. Now we start to see there are some places where different folks are being more or less productive. And we're also starting to see which staff kind of historically might be losing some potential productive time. Now, one thing that I think is really key is, like, we share these numbers internally with the team, right? This is not, again, we're not focusing on here is some sort of arbitrary target. What we're saying right now is here's where we're at. Does this match what you're feeling, right? Does this match how much work you've got, right? Because this could not be a problem with a particular team member. It could be that we're either giving too much overhead to one of our developers, right? And saying, hey, we need you to manage this other thing here, right? Well, that's going to hurt their project time unless we realize that, right? So that's kind of a tricky thing with just looking at the raw numbers. So we're going to get into that a little bit more. So we looked at the same sort of analysis, again, within that productive time piece of project work versus overhead. And I mean, here we're seeing, sort of what you might expect. Maybe between 20 and 40% overhead. It's not great, but it's not surprising. But really, we need to get kind of a little deeper, right? So we know we've got overhead and we've got productive time, but we've got averages, right? And if your team is anything like our team, if you've got you're going to have like, okay, hey, this month, Chuck's super busy, right? He's got a lot of stuff going on. He's, working on projects. And this month, Neil is very much not busy, right? Because, he's got this blocker. He can't work on this thing, or, client's late or something, right? There's some reason why he's not there. So, we want to kind of think about what's sort of a min and max sort of situation. So we look at kind of min and max historic project work, right? So then we start to see, so what's our kind of real capacity, right? What could we do versus what have we been doing, right? Assuming we actually arrange stuff reasonably well. So kind of our approach is historical minimum project work indicates, your team didn't have enough work to do, or they've got too much overhead that's eating up their time that they're putting in. Historical maximum, that indicates sort of where they've pegged out over that period of time. This is the most productive they've been on project work. Now, it might be lower than you expected, so you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. Does this team member have too many overhead tasks? Do they not have enough project work to do week to week? That's one of the really tricky things, is sort of connecting we've got a lot of work with week to week, what are we doing? So let's put this all into a framework. Kind of our concept is, you've got a certain amount of capacity, raw capacity, and and then you've got a certain amount of overhead that you're going to cut out of that, and that's based off of historic data. And then you subtract that, you've got what you're available to do work. Right? So that at least gives you a framework. And the nice thing about this is this is from data, right? This is stuff that you've actually looked at from your historic work. So it provides a framework, so now you can actually start to allocate projects. So we tend to allocate on a week-by-week basis on per staff. And we do it with a couple of different team members involved. So kind of the business development team and the PM team focus on allocating out whole projects kind of as we agree to do them over time, and then they parcel them up, the hours and the tasks between the different team members that are actually going to be doing the work. The production staff then looks at like the next 2 or 3 weeks just to make sure they know I've got time for this project on my plate, I've got time for this project on my plate, so they can sort of plan their day-to-day of when they need to do what they need to do. So that's all great. But what about emergencies? So another quote, I'm prepared for the worst, but hope for the best. So we actually like to take another little sort of cutout here and actually want to cut out reserve time. So this is time that we're not allocating for particular overhead tasks. We're not allocating for particular scheduled projects. Right? This is just a place where, hey, security patches dropped. We need to do this now. Right? It allows us to say yes to things. We've got, hey, this person, they really need help from this other team member to understand what they're working on. Maybe it's a junior dev or something like that. They want to talk to a senior dev. Well, our senior dev is going to have 5 hours of time in his week that's not allocated so that he can help everyone else be better or jump on an authority problem that comes up. So once you've got that, now you're ready to actually allocate your capacity. So here is a very simplified version of our spreadsheet. So we've got our staff, we've got availability, and then they've got their what hours they have available. We've got for each project kind of the project budget, and then what budget is currently not allocated for them. As a thing like, hey, we still have 50 hours of Project Juno to allocate. That's important knowledge to have, right? We'd prefer to actually have everything allocated out just so we know we're planning for that. So once you've got kind of your current projects allocated, you can actually leverage this information to help you make some decisions. So we've got a Google Sheet. So we've got our main allocation sheet, and then we've got a secondary allocation sheet that doesn't carry over any of the project data, only carries over the data of availability, and then we can put in new potential projects there that we've got kind of an order of magnitude estimate just to see where they fit, if they fit at all, right? Which allows us to, again, make some data-driven decisions of can we take on a project, and if we do, when is it likely to finish? Also, who has capacity to do it? And if we need to shuffle, that also allows us to have the conversation. So here's kind of an example of that, right? We've got 2 potential projects, we've got a budget. It's the same mechanism of allocating, but just not in the main sort of canonical capacity sheet. So, we tried to be a little tool agnostic because we don't want to say, well, this is this tool or that tool. This is more the process that we're talking about. So depending on your capacity tool, you might be able to do that. You might be able to do other things that are very neat. But if you've got the right tool in place and you've got the data that you've looked at and you've made some decisions about, then you're in a good place to sort of make those changes as you need to. So it's also important don't stop there, right? You want to keep tracking your times. and periodically update your assumptions. So we recently updated our internal PM estimation percentage based off of looking at what the actual PM percentage was over the past 2 years, right? So that allows us to be more accurate, which allows us to make smarter decisions. And then the other side of that is we can have a frank conversation as a team of like, hey, this is like really high, this piece here. Why is that? What can we do to make that process more efficient, right? We'll regularly have those sorts of conversations, and then we can say, okay, let's look into some tooling, or let's change up some responsibilities, or change an internal process to minimize something that's not really bringing the team value and not really helping us do what we want to do. So in conclusion, you want to start with data. Use your data to establish a realistic baseline, and then review and iterate regularly to improve your team's efficiency. So thanks to the Drupal Association and Drupal GovCon 2019. Any questions? Yeah.
In an ideal world where there are no emergencies, what do you do with this extra 5 or so hours that you?
Sure. So I'm not sure if the mic picks it up, so I'll repeat the question. In an ideal world where you don't use those 5 reserve hours, what do you do with that extra capacity? Apply it to the projects, right? So you just get ahead.
So finish the project ahead.
Yeah.
I have a question. How would you allocate if you had a technical issue, such as development tools breaking or an OS system changing, and you have to reestablish or reconfigure your tools? How would you allocate your time then? Would it be overhead?
It depends a little bit. If it is... In our case, if we're having to use something particularly esoteric for this particular project, we might allocate that from the unknowns of that project. But if this is our internal processes and our internal tool set, if something like that happens, that's probably going to come a combination out of the reserve, and it's going to be tracked as overhead because that's sort of the cost of doing business.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't work somewhere now with billable hours, but at a previous job as a developer, I would often have the account managers come over and say, we've hit our dead hours for the month. You can't bill anymore, but you still have to finish the project. And they were very not into all this. So how can someone like the staff that doesn't have those powers able to follow this and push against it?
Sure. So the question is if if you're in a place where this is not the culture, and how do you sort of lead folks towards this and push against it? I think there's a couple different pieces of that. One, I find places like that tend to have pretty high turnover, and so you can sort of frame it by, hey, we burned out another developer. That's bad. This is painful for everyone. That's part of a cost to the business, right? I know we're a 10-person shop, so we're not huge. So our accounts team is pretty close to the PM team. So if we get projects that don't work, we hear about it pretty vocally. So that's another piece, is like if you can kind of have a good connection between those teams so they understand that. But ultimately, it comes down to if you're not billing for work you're doing, you're actually losing money if you're in a billable hours situation, right? So the right solution is bill for the right number of hours so that you can do that. Because if you don't bill for this particular client and you have 20 unbillable hours for them, you're losing money, because even if that client wouldn't pay anymore, That's 20 hours you could have billed to another client, right? And made more money.
Unless the awkward position is they're expecting you to do it off the clock, and then, yeah, I mean, that's one of those things, it's a corporate culture thing, because to the owners, it doesn't cost them any more money to make you work off the clock. You know, the legality is questionable, but yeah, it's an unfortunate thing, and that's one of the reasons why we have a fairly low turnover rate. Is our expectation is our staff don't work nights and weekends, and they get paid for all the work that they do. So if they have to work nights or weekends, they're actually getting paid extra money, which is even more motivation for us to estimate projects correctly, so the company doesn't lose money by having to work hours beyond the estimates. Unfortunately, I think that's really sort of the business model of a lot of firms. Is you take any project you can get in the agency world, and then you just tell your staff to do it, no matter how many hours it takes them, and you only pay them for the first 40. And it's, you know, great for the business. You can get all sorts of work you couldn't take otherwise because the client couldn't afford to pay for it, but you burn out your staff really fast.
Yeah.
So, if you have a project that's often an agile framework, and then you say your stakeholders have a sprint that is much more test heavy or development heavy, so you have these hours per resource, but that doesn't necessarily align with what you're supposed to be spending on. And so I guess that would kind of like fuzzy the boundaries between what you have as your, I forgot what you said, your like the bucket to have people working on stuff that's not necessarily, like if we don't have direction really on stuff that they can be working on, but we don't also know what they can do for future work, what do you, like how do you guys handle?
Sure. So the question is in sort of an agile framework where you've got some teams or resources and a certain amount of each of that member of team is allocated per week to the project. On the weeks where you're not doing design, let's say, or you're not doing testing or whatever, what about those resources that are allocated? And that's a great question. In those situations, for us, those tend to be, we tend to structure those like a retainer relationship. So a given client has a certain number of hours per month, and then it's on the project manager to adjust the capacity on the sheet, in communication with the stakeholders, like, hey, we're going into this phase, so we're going to be doing a lot of testing, so we're not going to be using a lot of dev. So since they know that, they're going to actually free up capacity on that developer, and then they can communicate with the rest of the team, like, hey, Neil has some capacity this week if there's some tasks that he could help with.
So I think particularly when we are doing Agile, we're trying to do it around the backlog. So we try to keep some things sort of towards the top of the backlog in case for some reason we can't do work on what was expected for that sprint, that something else can be promoted so that the client's not going to lose their retainer time.
I think we have time for one more question, yeah.
The tools and methods that you use to estimate someone's productivity, how much of that data collection is dependent on that team member accurately estimating their productivity versus someone independently evaluating?
Sure. So the question is how much with the method we outlined, how much of the productivity estimate is based on a team member accurately estimating their productivity versus someone else observing. So the team member is not directly estimating their productivity. What we're doing is we're looking at historical data of hours they tracked. So if they build 100 hours this month and we have 20 hours of productive overhead, it's 120 productive hours. That's kind of what we're looking at. We're not trying to say, well, is this person being as productive? This isn't really set up to do kind of individual performance management or anything like that. This is more for capacity for the team as a whole. I had one other point with that. Yeah, and it's based on historic data. So that's the other important thing. Is like, the goal is to plan based on data, and then say, okay, let's review this. And then we don't like how these percentages are. Let's talk about efficiencies around that. So there's not an external person determining how productive someone is or not. It's just, this is what the numbers are.
Also, to add to that slightly, we don't keep timesheets, so we don't have records of somebody clocked in at 9 and clocked out at 5. The only record of people working is the time that they track either in project tasks or internal tasks. So anyone who doesn't want to look like they weren't working will find tasks to put their time into. Also they're really motivated then to record all their project hours. But then also just to not look like they weren't working, they want to accurately record all their overhead hours. And then if they're not that good at their non-productive hours, this is kind of assumed based on the total of hours that they were expected in the month. You subtract their productive hours and their overhead hours. Even if it's not recorded, everything that's left was non-productive.
All right, and we are over time, so thank you, everyone.